Thank you. So I'm not used to having to stay on the stage. I was told that I had to stay on the stage, so if you see me fall off, please forgive me. I'll get back up. It's always fun putting the security guy right before lunch because, as usual, the security team is responsible for holding up every IT project that you ever want to get started on. So, as he mentioned, I am the Director of Threat Research for HP Security Research. In my role, I develop and drive the overall strategy, the threat research strategy for HP around the domains of malware, vulnerability, and rapid threat information exchange. So most of the time, I work with folks that reverse engineer a lot of the different vulnerabilities, the malware, and things like that used to target and ultimately compromise organizations. So by now, of course, this is probably a moot point. I believe a variation of this was in the last talk, but I've always found it helpful to make sure we start with the same set of definitions. So while you read that up there, I'll pause for a little bit, but I want to mention that the pessimistic security, girl or guy often looks at that definition and says, oh, great, outsourced information technology where I have less control, less visibility, and even less influence over what the IT teams are actually doing. At least back on premise, I can escalate to the CIO or similar and try to get the support I need. And that's a pessimistic security guy. Very important individuals to have on your team. They often passionately think about the attacker. But what you really want to look at when you think about the cloud is more from an optimistic point of view. So the more optimistic security person is going to look at this as an opportunity, right? It's going to look at the cloud as an opportunity to rapidly accomplish a lot of the security initiatives that just seem infeasible or impractical today on premise. Most of you, I believe the audience in here is predominantly enterprise focused. So you will know the struggles that you have with an organic organization, right? You've grown IT organically. You do not have all the control over whether or not systems are patched and kept up to date, right? The cloud can change this dramatically for you, especially allowing you to focus on the gaps that you should be focusing on and where the threat actors are going. And I'll talk a little bit about that in more detail because in many ways, the cloud not only shifts the particular risks, but it enables you to do things that you weren't able to do on premise. On the opposite end of the spectrum, though, it also further illustrates the deficiencies that we're already having today on premise, especially as it regards defense in depth and a lot of the breaches. And so I'll talk to you a little bit more about that. The last few years, we've started to see attacks, specifically targeted attacks, against software as a service and other types of solutions. And what they do is they illustrate where people say traditional security fails, which is a point of contention for me. I always hate to hear the terms traditional security controls are failing because in my opinion, we've never gone and completed the process. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. So optimistically speaking, the cloud is actually great. It's an exciting opportunity to really accomplish a lot of the issues that we have today on premise. So it's easy to understand the economic benefits of a pay-per-use model, right? Even the attackers today are benefiting from a pay-per-use model in their use of infrastructure to attack, right? To distribute their command and control centers, right? They charge each other to redirect traffic, to purchase bots and things like that. And so when we think about it from a traditional IT perspective, you can definitely see how using the cloud or moving to the cloud can allow you to externalize a lot of the traditional and fairly costly operations associated with IT management, ongoing governance and provisioning and whatnot. And more importantly, it enables you to focus on the core business task at hand. Underlying cloud technology and what you'll find in cloud providers is the use of orchestration. Okay, this orchestration, these frameworks, there's several open source and commercially available ones. They're essentially technology that enables the cloud provider to automate a lot of the provisioning and configuration. In the last talk I heard about spinning up a server in 45 seconds, right? These are traditionally manual efforts. And so here you're really automating a lot of that. Now some of the more mature IT operations have already started to move to this model, especially since virtualization is of course not new. We've had it for several years. But when you think about that, the cloud allows you to expand and contract your specific usage, resource usage based on your immediate needs, right? And that kind of orchestration enables us to get those cost efficiencies. From a security perspective, the technology behind orchestration is key. Here's the optimistic viewpoint, right? Today, many of us on-premise struggle to keep our machines patched and up to date. Not only running the latest patches for our operating system, especially as it relates to security vulnerabilities, but something as simple as, is my endpoint security running the latest signature? Is the engine even working properly? Things like this. And so if you think about it, that's a challenge that we have on-premise, and at least in the cloud, right? With remote users, it gets complicated, but in the cloud, what you have is, if you leverage this orchestration engine, right? If you use that to your advantage, you could insert some type of security agent into that instance so that upon startup, right? When you spin up a new instance in the cloud, you're already automatically connecting back and configuring the security policy for that individual instance. You can firewall it off, make sure it only gets put on a certain network, right? Because the cool thing about the cloud is, if the controller in the cloud does not understand anything about the resource, that resource is not functioning, right? Everything has to go through the cloud. That's how billing is enabled, things of that nature, through the cloud controller. So there's great opportunities here from that optimistic viewpoint to address some of these deficiencies and even get greater governance over what's actually happening in your environment. For the first time, you have that visibility into the very detailed configuration at the network, potentially, and host levels, depending on where your cloud provider fits in. So you're here to understand the security implications of actually moving one or more of your projects, at least that's the context that I'm going to be talking to you about, moving one or more of your IT projects into the cloud. Of course, the last thing you want to do is accept more risk by doing so than when you started with your on-premise solution. The picture up there is illustrative of what happens when you invite a security professional like myself to the table, and it reminds me of a passage I was reading in a book on my way back from RSA last week. It was talking about the emerging field of DevOps. Here's the quote from that picture. This is actually a quote being made by the fictitious VP of IT operations, and I'll just call out the specifics. Here they refer to as security professionals as always coming up with a million reasons why some particular action that the IT team or that the company as a whole wants to take is going to create one or more security holes that alien space hackers are going to exploit, right? And my favorite is we talk about natural things like stealing intellectual property and whatnot, and then of course we end with, and pictures of our loved ones. But that's the reality. For those that have ever lived or supported or worked through breaches in your organizations, you know this happens all the time. Any users in here on Facebook, browsing the internet, using corporate resources to just do general browsing know that you store a lot of material there. So your pictures of your loved ones is not a far stretch when we talk about a compromise or a breach. Assessing risk in the cloud often seems like an unsolvable puzzle when you think about it. I mean, there's a lot of visibility lost, right? It's hard enough to do security on-premise correctly. We struggle with that every day. I mean, simply look at the news, and you'll find no shortage of announcements of breaches occurring, right, that demonstrate clearly failures that are occurring inside even the most mature organizations where we have pretty solid IT operations. And especially the enterprise can often be one of those places, if given the bandwidth and the power and the support by upper management, it's one of those areas where you can actually make a difference. But even some of those organizations are struggling for a number of different reasons, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So take all of that into account, right? Listen to all the messaging around how traditional security is failing. Then tell the security professional that they're going to have even less control and less visibility over the infrastructure, right? And then, of course, let's add the fact that the cloud provider may be less interested in being transparent with you about how they apply their security controls, right? Put all that together, that does not paint a good picture when you think about how you assess your risks, right? Which is a very big challenge for folks that are interested in moving or considering a move to the cloud. You have a lot of things to consider, but it's not unsolvable. The nice thing is others have created a lens that makes trying to assess the risk at least somewhat more feasible than you might imagine. Between organizations or consortiums like the Cloud Security Alliance and the European Agency for Network and Information Security, and companies like HP and Microsoft, as well as others, right, there is no shortage of information available on how you approach understanding the risks of moving to the cloud. The Cloud Security Alliance actually publishes a detailed set of guidance. They have 2 documents that I definitely suggest you read. One of them is in version 3 at the moment, and it's around their mapping of security controls to domains, okay? These domains essentially range from areas like IT governance to things as far as security as a service, right? What does security as a service need to look like in a cloud? What should you be looking for? And the nice thing about this is you take that information and provides practical guidance on how you either reduce or eliminate the risk depending on what you're trying to accomplish. The second document that they publish, and I'll show later on, is an actual cloud controls matrix. This document is very nice because it actually is a nice way to map the applicability of a given security control against the architecture, against the cloud deployment models, right, against regulatory requirements, things like PCI, HIPAA, high-tech, you know, and so on and so forth. So there are existing frameworks out there to get started in understanding how to assess the risk that you're likely going to face when you consider moving a project into the cloud. My opinion is you can absolutely solve the cloud security puzzle, or at least make sure that your business understands the risks far better than you might expect. But the way you do this is you have to prepare yourself for risk-based analysis. You have to familiarize yourself with the threats that are both specific to the cloud as well as what you already know, threats that are not specific. And you must do your due diligence. I cannot stress that enough. A lot of the controls and the things that I talked about earlier, the documents coming out of Cloud Security Alliance and ANISA, they're great starting points. But as you know, your organizations are different. Your requirements are different. Do not stop at compliance, right? And they talk a lot about compliance. And that's an important goal. Obviously, for business reasons and legal reasons, you have to comply with a lot of the regulatory requirements. But more importantly, the problem is compliance is often kind of like a blueprint for the bad guys. The bad guys know exactly where you stop investing in security, and they use that against you. Okay, so preparing for risk-based analysis. Like most things in life, it actually helps if you understand what you're trying to accomplish. The less you understand, the less likely you are to get what you're interested in achieving. I'm not going to walk us through an entire process as it is. I'm right before lunch, and I don't want to bore people with really detailed risk analysis, but I do want to show you a couple pictures. My goal here is to get you to a point of clarification on the risks that you're likely to face so that you understand whether or not the risks can be avoided, whether or not they can be reduced through either development or IT operations-based mitigations, whether or not you can accept them. Maybe your risk tolerance is such that you're willing to accept them. Or in some cases, you may be willing to transfer the risk. Cloud insurance is actually an emerging field that would enable transfer of risk to a third party. But the more traditional approaches today, right, are when you talk about transferring risks, we build that into the contract. We use warranties and service level agreements with the cloud provider to make sure that we understand where that risk transfers. And that's kind of at the heart of assessing risk here, is that the threats for the most part of moving something into the cloud are relatively similar to the threats you already have today. So really you're shifting the risks, you know, from your on-premise into the cloud. So areas, roles, and responsibilities, who owns what, who is responsible for the governance, the security, and whatnot, are all areas where that shift occurs, and you need to understand that. That's where you can get yourself into trouble. If you do not understand who's responsible for ensuring, you know, certain controls are in place, you're going to end up accepting more risk than you should have. And this is a very common problem I see when folks were, and I still see it today, but very early on when people were rushing to the cloud, what do you think happened? they never shift the paradigm, right? Their thinking never shifts from on-premise solutions. On-premise, there's this trust boundary, which of course I'm fascinated by as a security professional. We say, oh, if it's in the corporate network, it's trusted. Users in here are trusted. Maybe we'll segregate and isolate specific things, but if you're operating inside the quote-unquote perimeter, it's trusted. And so what I would see is some IT operations or development teams go procure a Amazon Web Services, right, some EC2 instances, and start deploying some of the IT projects that they're considering. Now, understand they were only being deployed for testing purposes, right? This was pre any final decision being made, but they kept getting, an incident kept getting thrown up, and our cybersecurity team kept getting alerted. Well, what happened? They didn't understand, right? They didn't make the shift in their mind that when they deploy this default instance, this software that they were pushing to the cloud is insecure by default, has hard-coded passwords, ports are open, things are not encrypted, they've put it up there, and they forget that attackers understand what the address space looks like for a lot of the cloud hosting providers. And they're just simply scanning them, looking for these insecure defaults. These are low-hanging fruit. And so I see a lot of teams in the rush for cloud, they'll haphazardly deploy something without any real understanding of the implications, right? And that's a challenge that you're going to face no matter what you're trying to accomplish. So one of the first steps you need to do is, when you're talking about evaluating risk, is to determine exactly what data, application, or function you're interested in considering moving to the cloud, right? So with cloud computing, you can actually take your data and your applications as a whole. They don't need to reside in the same location, so you can choose to shift specific functions in the cloud, leaving some on-premise or with another third party. Maybe as part of business continuity planning, you're using storage as a service. That seems like a fairly straightforward option, especially from a security perspective. You're only paying for the storage you need, and as long as you're encrypting and you maintain controls over the keys, you, not the cloud provider, maintains controls over the keys, it seems fairly safe, right, to push that out. But that's an example of kind of, deciding what it is you want to accomplish. Maybe you're considering moving your messaging system and supporting systems like Active Directory or directory services into the cloud. That gets a little bit more complicated, right? Where do those functions lie? Will some remain in-house, or can they be completely moved into, let's say, a public cloud? So if you understand what you're trying to accomplish, like which asset you're trying to move to the cloud, the next step is really to understand how it is currently delivered today, right? And how it's accessed, right? How does your IT department deliver this today, and how is it accessed? This seems like a common sense approach. I get it. But it turns out that this is one of the biggest areas of failure for a number of different reasons. People just don't do their due diligence. Everyone says, sure, I follow a risk-based approach. Sure, I understand what I'm trying to accomplish. But the reality is we often don't have the key contributors and stakeholders, if you will, in the room. We don't agree on how the system is currently deployed. And this can actually introduce a lot more risk, kind of like the example I gave earlier about moving something into, IT operations moving a particular product into the cloud, not understanding its current security state, right? They didn't make the paradigm shift that if you're moving into the public cloud, the users that are accessing it are untrusted, okay? This step is actually overlooked most of the times and done quite poorly, which of course leads to just general IT project failures, not just those specific to the cloud. The effort, underlying this particular area is to bring together at a minimum at least the developer and IT stakeholders. This gets complicated when you're talking about a third-party application because your developers, aren't in-house. You've procured it from someone else. But you want to bring those stakeholders together at a minimum, and this effort should serve as a precursor to understanding, right, how your critical efforts are going to be affected or impacted by moving to the cloud. This is where you're going to do threat modeling, where you're going to look at development and IT operations costing and sizing, and similar types of efforts. Right? The more you understand at this stage about how the technology is currently deployed and accessed, the better off you're going to be in setting yourself up for success when you try to assess the risks of moving to the cloud. So with that understanding, the next logical step is to really consider the different deployment models. What I have up here is actually a snapshot from one of the Cloud Security Alliance document that I mentioned earlier. And what it's meant to do is illustrate that there are a number of different options that cloud consumers have. If you look at the, I guess, second row where it says public, right? Here you see that the infrastructure is owned and managed by a third party. It's located off-premise, and it's accessible and consumed by untrusted users, right? So imagine if you were a web hosting provider and maybe you were using Amazon EC2 and you were deploying a LAMP stack, right? This is a good example of kind of pushing it into a public cloud. You're still responsible perhaps for some of the configuration of the data that's used and served through that web server stack, but it's ultimately being hosted and managed, in the public cloud. Private is, of course, the opposite, right? Here you're talking about it being done by the organization alone. It's managed by the organization, it's owned by it, it's located on premise, and then, of course, it's considered trusted. More on that one in a little bit. Hybrid is usually a combination of both the public and the private together, and it can intermingle depending on which of the columns we're talking about. To effectively evaluate the hybrid deployment model, you really had to have done a good job in the previous slide, right, in that previous step. You need to have a solid understanding of your architecture and which components are going to reside on-premise and which components are going to move to the cloud, right? This can be a considerable effort, or it may be straightforward depending on the actual software architecture that you're considering moving. And maybe you may even be starting from scratch, so it might not be too bad. Any given deployment model can, of course, also affect your compliance requirements. As many of you know and here, responsible for security and compliance, there are a lot of regulations that you have to comply with that often require a certain level of visibility into the underlying physical infrastructure all the way up through the logical and similar. And so if you don't have that visibility and your cloud provider's not providing that to you, it can make it a lot more complicated. So I mentioned earlier I would talk a little bit about trusted users. Notice that middle column, I talk about private and trusted. This is actually the subject of many of the breaches that you see today, right? Is this notion that traditional security controls end with, well, I have a firewall, I have an intrusion prevention system, I installed endpoint security. What about the users that are accessing trusted resources, critical assets? Have you baselined them? Do you analyze and understand how they interact? Right? That's a big challenge. That happens to be the lowest hanging fruit. And so even when you consider the breaches in on-premise, this is where we've kind of fallen behind. Now, to be fair, it's not always it's not always trivial, especially in an organizations as large as those that you run and belong to. It's not trivial to baseline that. But here is that opportunity. If you're moving to the cloud, you have an opportunity to focus on that specific gap that you're currently not addressing, okay? There was about, I want to say 9 months ago, though it was talked about this year and towards the end of last year, but it was 9 months ago, I'm told, by the security researchers that uncovered it. There was a repurposed banking Trojan used to target Salesforce.com and extract the information, right? So this is a home computer infected with malware that's been around for a long time that has been repurposed to hijack the credentials for Salesforce.com and then used to start pulling down customer information. I don't care if that was hosted completely within your four walls, on-premise, your own customer relationship management solution. You have the same problem in your traditional IT environment, right? you have that same problem. And you have the myriad of other requirements of keeping things patched and up to date and doing all the other security controls. So that's an example of where moving to the cloud, if done correctly, you can actually start to focus on some of these gaps, okay, that you have, because that's what the attackers are doing. So thinking about the cloud service model is also another critical one. Just as important as the deployment model we talked about, there are also inherent implications, right? Inherent risks associated with the specific type of cloud service that you're willing to consider. Put another way, your security posture, your compliance posture is ultimately dependent on the cloud provider's ability, the cloud provider's underlying architecture, how they operate, as well as how you consider a deployment and a service model vehicle. Infrastructure as a service typically provides the greatest level of visibility. And of course, as you move up the stack, going to the right, what you can imagine is you lose a lot more control and visibility, which to security guys, that's scary, right? I don't want to lose control and visibility. I have enough time arguing with the IT operations personnel to give me access to log data that I know is available, because they know that if they try to do that, they're likely to bring down accounts payable or accounts receivable. And they don't want to get chewed out, right? Because that's a risk that the company's not willing to accept. You don't want to affect payroll. And especially in the enterprises, the larger ones, this is a lot more exacerbated, where you have kind of the silos and the fiefdoms between IT security and IT operations, with, of course, IT operations generally always winning, especially after incidents like bringing down payroll. So this is kind of scary, but by the same token, this is an example of the shifting risks, right? If you're adopting a software as a service, the idea being that particular provider, right, is responsible for a lot of the security controls that you would have been responsible for traditionally. So given that they're hosting these things on the internet, you would imagine that they want your business. They cannot afford to suffer reputational losses or damages because of a security breach. So they're really good about making sure, or they try to be anyways, the good ones, try to be really good and really thorough about focusing on those gaps and making sure the entire security stack is as secure as possible. And like you always hear today, even in traditional environments, you will be breached. The trick is improving your response time, right? Improving your ability to detect, right? You want to decrease the amount of time it takes for you to detect that there's been a breach, and you want to improve the response time. You want to make that as small of a window as possible so that you can notify your customers in a timely fashion, you can contain, and ultimately remediate and go forward, right? So there is this shifting of risks, and because they're highly focused and not spread across multiple IT projects and other compliance level requirements, there's actually a great opportunity for them to provide far better security than what you might be able to do today on premise. In some cases, your risk profile associated with the move to a cloud service, right, will actually increases. Sometimes it's going to reduce, and in many others, it's just going to change with risks migrating from one domain to another. I talked a little bit about that, but imagine, the story I mentioned earlier. There was it was a workflow management tool, okay? This workflow management tool, by default, had hard-coded passwords available in the documentation, downloadable from the internet. And it was used to track, specific, we'll just call it data. It contained intellectual property for the business. And the IT operations team simply deployed it into AWS, not really considering how that should be configured and locked down, okay? So that's an example of the types of things that you've got to consider. The further down you go, right, the more you are actually responsible for. So if you're just consuming infrastructure as a service, you're actually responsible for a large set of things, because you're essentially being provided, all the basic plumbing, but what type of application or service you put on there is literally up to you. As you move up the stack, more of that shifts to the provider. Once you understand what you're trying to accomplish, how things are currently delivered, and the candidate cloud deployment and service models you're considering, you can actually start to put the pieces of the puzzle together, okay? One of the easiest places to start is to try to identify the specific policy and regulatory requirements, right? These could result from privacy regulations and technology policy guidelines, either internally sourced as part of your governance and policy model, or externally sourced. They could be record-keeping regulations and guidelines, or even more industry-specific guidelines like PCI, SOX, HIPAA, HITECH, or similar. Oftentimes, these requirements will inhibit your ability to choose a specific deployment model or even service model, right? So that's something to keep in mind. I usually ask folks to start by defining their risk tolerance at this stage, right? And I'm using a variation of the confidentiality, integrity, and availability method as a means of assessing how you feel and what your risk appetite is when you're considering moving a particular thing to the cloud, okay? I start usually by asking the basic question. How would you rate the harm that would come if the asset, right, that you deployed into the cloud became widely public or widely distributed? How would you feel if an employee of the cloud provider accessed the asset? Sometimes it's unavoidable, but what does that make you feel like? What about if it was manipulated by an outsider? What if the process or function failed, right? You had downtime. How would that impact? What if there was an unexpected change in the information or data? And of course, availability as a whole, right? Early 2000s, you could be down for, when I say early 2000s, circa like 2001, you could be down to almost a week to repair, let's say an outbreak. Now, especially in certain organizations, being down an hour is not a good thing. And you guys, if those in IT operations, know that pain. So the last item is essentially, before you can perform a risk assessment, you have to agree on how you define your risk exposure. So this should involve a wide range of stakeholders, not only your IT and developers, right, but also your finance, your business stakeholders, and other similar individuals that need to come to the table and understand. This is where I told you, I'll try not to bore you guys with the risk management stuff, but I have to stress enough that this is often subject to a significant amount of debate, and it's critical that a consensus is reached before you engage in this type of process. What I have up there is taken from a paper that was published by Microsoft recently, and it depicts a detailed example definition of how to define the impacts to an organization. In this case, they were modeling the risks for a government agency, so that might be relevant for some of you in here, okay? If you look up there, and I don't know if you can read, I'll try to read it out to you. There's a description of the impact that includes the duration, what the scope is from an organizational or operational perspective, the specific reputational impact on the stakeholders, as well as implications from a legal, compliance, or environmental perspective. Again, stressing consensus, I can't do it enough here. If you're not on the same page when you're doing the risk assessment, you're pretty much going to invalidate your entire effort. This is an area that is technically directly responsible for leaving IT and security teams in a handicapped position when it comes to defending the network. This is what has us chasing our tails. We're fixing good vulnerabilities, but we're not always fixing the right vulnerabilities because the business cannot agree on what the most critical assets are and what the most critical risks are. This is just another example that talks about how we define the likelihood of a given risk occurring, and then what an ISO schematic would look like for performing a risk management process, right? So we talk about establishing our context, which we just reviewed. Then we move on to identifying the risks, followed by analyzing them, evaluating them, and then, of course, treating them. We talked about whether you accept them or reject them, accept them or retain them, reduce them, avoid them, or transfer them. And of course, you can review and decide. So again, this is the end goal is for you to be set up to follow this type of process. You take these 6 steps when you're considering how you're actually going to fare. And so if you take the examples, which the slide deck I'm told will be later published, what you're able to do is at the end of performing your risk assessment, you should be able to rate your risks. Here's just a snippet from that same paper. Rate the risk in terms of what the likelihood would be, what the impact would be, and whatnot. And this helps you understand exactly what types of risks you're likely to expect if you're moving to the cloud. Finally, you can perform a gap analysis. So I told you, don't stop with compliance, but compliance is a great place to start, right? There are controls from lists like those published by the Cloud Security Alliance and certification requirements from INISA that you can actually use to help understand what will need to be addressed by moving to the cloud. So here you see, if you start with the cloud deployment and service model and architecture in mind, you can then map that to a set of security controls to identify the gaps, and then further map that to your compliance model to understand whether or not you're going to have challenges becoming compliant and what additional gaps you're going to need to address. So the Cloud Security Alliance, as I mentioned, has a cloud controls matrix Excel sheet that really enables this to be fairly straightforward, and I strongly suggest you taking a look at that and spending some time with that. So when you've done all this, when you've done your risk assessment and you feel solid about it, you have consensus amongst the stakeholders, now it's time to invite the candidate cloud providers or vendors to the table. You want to spend time with them, understanding how transparent they're going to be about their compensating controls. You want to make sure that you review the gaps that you believe you've identified. Have them review the gaps that you've identified, right? Your cloud provider should be your partner, right, when it comes to security. You need to partner with them on making sure you have the most effective solution in place. They, after all, want your business, and you, of course, want the cost efficiencies. So make sure you partner with them. One of the next things I tell folks to do after they've done the risk assessment, they've worked with the cloud provider, and everyone thinks they understand where we're at, is I ask them to look at the actual threats in the cloud, okay? You have to keep abreast of the threat landscape just like you do today. What attackers are doing to organizations like yours and around the world, right? This is part of the continuous process for risk management. It should be reviewed frequently. As new attacks come up, you should reassess that risk management profile, right? As part of the risk management effort, you should reassess. Have new gaps shown up? Have some gaps gone away? Right? You want to look for gaps that are going to expose your defenses, and you want to find out how you can work with your cloud provider to address them. Cloud tenants actually come under threats by both insiders at the cloud provider. Some people might think of some recent disclosures in 2013 as an example of an insider who accessed information and disclosed it, to the world. You also may come under the threat from a co-tenant. Now, limits placed by the cloud provider on how, what's allowed to actually execute, in the service can actually make the threats from co-tenants fairly infeasible. Not impossible, but difficult at best. So as you move up the cloud service model from infrastructure as a service all the way up to the software as a service, you can imagine the threats from the co-tenants are, in theory, far more mitigated and less likely to happen. Not so much the case from just infrastructure as a service, but again, there are different means and motivations, and I'll talk a little bit about focusing on what the attackers are doing today as a way to prioritize which threats you mitigate and you focus on first. Cloud providers, if you're in here and you're a business interested in providing cloud services, you're concerned about threats that result from the actual tenants themselves, either attacking you as a cloud provider, trying to circumvent your billing, or trying to circumvent your controls in order to gain access to another tenant, or even worse, attacking the tenant themselves directly. Of course, the other aspect is side effects. Many of your companies in here today may actually be compromised, may have bots in your environment. Well, that's a problem, don't get me wrong, but imagine that occurring in a cloud provider's environment. An IP address all the way up to an entire ASN may end up hitting a blacklist. And that's a really expensive process for the cloud provider to go through, right? And then, of course, they can shut down your virtual machines as they try to get rid of the problem, right? So that's something that you have to consider when you're in that kind of situation. Threats to tenants. I mentioned malicious insiders. So anytime you move your data inside someone else's cloud, you're adding a trust boundary. Like it or not, you are now trusting the employees and contractors of the cloud service provider themselves, right, with your data. Administrators are going to have unavoidable access. They need that in order to provide the services. They may intentionally attack you, or worse, be subject or victim to an attack themselves, right? And an administrator of a poorly deployed cloud provider architecture is really, really, really good for the bad guy because they have access, right? Unfettered access, potentially, if the cloud provider has not done their due diligence. Now, most of your mature cloud providers have obviously focused their efforts on mitigating these risks, but that's something you want to spend time talking to them about. How do they detect malicious use by their administrators? How do they find abnormalities? And there's several different ways to mitigate these things. And I think I'm running a little bit out of time, so I'm gonna talk a little bit about, today a lot of the mitigations come at it from a contractual perspective or a cryptographic perspective. The problem with contracts is that in often cases, even though you worked it into the SLA with the cloud provider, you're not really the victim. It's whoever's data that you're hosting on there. Maybe it is your intellectual property, in which case you are the victim. But if it contains like personally identifiable information, that's actually many of us in here, right? If our data is sitting out there in the cloud, which is a little bit concerning when you think about that approach. And of course, cryptography can be used, but it's easier to do in certain environments and harder to do in others. And when you employ cryptography, you're often trading confidentiality, right, and integrity for availability. Okay, you're putting your money down on those areas. Anybody remember one of the biggest threats that happened last year? Something by the name of CryptoLocker, right? Malware being deployed and encrypting your data and then charging you for access to the key. That sounds like a scary thing to happen in the cloud, right? You definitely don't want to end up in that area. From a malicious co-tenant perspective, I talked a little bit about that. The thing about the co-tenants, today the attacker doesn't have to invest at all, right? The attacker does not have to invest at all in dealing with that particular area. They don't need to worry about being a co-tenant on the same platform and breaking in. Why? That's a very expensive operation. They have to find issues in the cloud provider's orchestration and automation. Not saying they don't exist, but isn't it much easier to go straight to the user of the cloud service? Isn't it much easier to infect them with a piece of malware that takes their credentials and then accesses the data directly, right? So threats from malicious co-tenants, not saying they don't happen, by someone being on there, but there's a much easier and economical method for the bad guys. I've rarely seen an architecture, though, especially considering cloud providers, I've rarely seen a software system built where the greatest threat comes from the user already on the system, right? When people do the threat modeling, I don't see that happening. Threats to providers, I talked a little bit about that already, so I'll kind of move on. So I kind of want to leave you guys with compliance does not equal security, right? You have to understand what's happening in the attack landscape. Make sure you understand what attackers are leveraging today. In 2012, malware was already targeting customers of cloud payroll services. We also found malware that was sabotaging internal database stores, right? These are examples of targeted attacks. I talked to you a little bit about the repurposed banking Trojan. It was a Zeus variant that was used to target Salesforce.com. Now, these were not vulnerabilities in the case of Salesforce, it was not a vulnerability in Salesforce.com. It had to do with the user, and their credentials being, if you will, stolen or hijacked in order to access that. There was also a vulnerability discovered around April of last year in Office 365, okay, that an attacker was able to send a carefully constructed spear phishing email that had a link. You click on the link, and it tricked Word into thinking that it was trying to authenticate with the Office 365 instance, passing its token, its authentication token, out to the attacker. Now, no malware, no payload, nothing. Simple email, clicking on a link, and now for at least a period of time, the attacker can just directly authenticate into your cloud service and do that. So again, these expose those gaps that I mentioned earlier. The same gaps, right? These are targeted attacks. Today, we don't have, to our knowledge, we don't have as an industry this major outbreak occurring. But it does help you see and understand the gaps that you already have even on premise, right? That Salesforce.com is a great example. If that CRM was contained within your four walls, you would have had the same problems of trying to detect that someone's credentials had been accessed, unless, of course, you took that step of baselining and normalizing and understanding what abnormal user behavior looks like, specifically as they authenticate and use your system. Keep yourself honest, right? Make sure that you don't accept more risk than what you started out. When you think about it, you know, if you do your due diligence, if you do proper threat modeling, you can actually significantly reduce the attack surface, right? You can do things and achieve security initiatives that you struggle to do today. And that's a critical benefit of moving to the cloud. But you've got to do it right. So by preparing yourself for risk-based analysis, familiarizing yourself with threats to the cloud, and making sure that you do that due diligence, I believe that you can solve the cloud security puzzle. You'll be in a much better shape, and you may actually be in a greater security position if you do it right. Thank you.